I was an accident. My mum and dad were very young when I was conceived, 17 and 18. And my mum was under enormous pressure to have an abortion, which initially to her made sense. The appointment was booked, but she decided not to go through with it. And she knew that if she told anyone, she would come under massive pressure to go to that hospital and go through the termination. So she did what she was explicitly told she could not do, which was eat before the appointment. She cooked herself a full English breakfast, like she would never normally do this. And that was her insurance policy to make sure she couldn't go through with it. So it is literally the fry-up that saved my life.
I think, Wes Streeting, we'd better start with a little bit of an explanation about the fantastic title. To what does it allude?
Well, one boy, two bills and a fry-up. The one boy is obviously me. The two Bills are my two grandfathers. Dad's side of the family, Bill Streeting, Royal Navy World War II veteran, civil engineer all his life. Very much a sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, work hard, play by the rules, serve king and country in the war, love queen and country throughout the rest of his life, and a solid working class Tory. The only time he voted anything else was Liberal, quote unquote, to keep Labour out in Tower Hamlets where he lived. And then the very different Bill, my mum's dad, Bill Crowley, in and out of prison throughout my mum's childhood, throughout my childhood, string of convictions for armed robbery, kind of East End crook really, originally from South London. Very loving grandfather nonetheless, but led a very different life. And then the fry-up, it's not just I love a fry-up, and it's not an East End affectation. It's I was an accident. My mum and dad were very young when I was conceived, 17 and 18. And my mum was under enormous pressure to have an abortion, which initially to her made sense. The appointment was booked, but she decided not to go through with it. And she knew that if she told anyone, she would come under massive pressure to go to that hospital and go through the termination. So she did what she was explicitly told she could not do, which was eat before the appointment. She cooked herself a full English breakfast, like she would never normally do this. And that was her insurance policy to make sure she couldn't go through with it. So it is literally the fry-up that saved my life.
So that's where the book starts, which
Yeah.
is a wonderful way to engage the reader. But also it just tells the reader so much about your mum, because actually that is a big, big decision for a teenage girl to take, and to take on her own, even though she did have a very close family around her.
She did, but the abortion was solving the problem, and she was unsolving the problem. And I remember when I turned 17 having a conversation with my dad saying, it's only just dawned on me that when you were my age, you were a father. And that, I cannot imagine how terrifying that must have been for him. So I don't judge my dad or anyone else in my family for thinking that, you know, my mum having a baby at that age was not a good idea. And as I went through my late teens and 20s, I sort of thought my parents really did sacrifice a lot. Because there's a sense of jeopardy at the beginning of the book without giving too much away. And when I shared all the drafts with my parents. And I think my dad, as he was reading that first chapter, thought, oh my God, I come out terribly from this. Like, I'm the father that wants nothing to do with this child. And, my dad, as I say in the book, was there for me on the day I was born, and he's been there for me ever since. But nonetheless, they were a young couple, a poor couple, and a short-lived couple. And having a kid at that time in those conditions was a really big struggle, and one I'm very grateful for.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your mum? Because it's her side of the family, isn't it, that has the criminality that you have referred to.
Yeah.
And actually for her mum, that was a terrible
Oh,
start.
it was. It was. And the fascinating thing for me, sort of talking to my mum about our family history, is sort of found it hard to write about my nan and the life she led before I was born, because it's almost like a different person, because She had ended up in prison herself for getting involved in my granddad's criminal activities. There she shared a cell with Christine Keeler, who found herself at the centre of one of the British scandals of modern British politics, Profumo affair. They formed a lifelong friendship, and my nan was carrying my mum in prison. So my mum wasn't literally born in prison. She was born up the road in Holloway, in Whittington.
Yeah.
She was in Holloway prison, shut the road at Whittington Hospital. So she gave birth to my mum in hospital, chained to the bed with prison officers surrounding her. And that wasn't the only consequence of my granddad's criminality. Their relationship was pretty toxic, pretty violent, and my mum grew up around that violence, and it had a big impact on her childhood. She was in and out of school. I mean, any teacher will tell you that kids don't leave problems at the school gates, and that was very much my mum's experience. So she had a very, very hard childhood. And to be honest, as people read the book, they might conclude initially that Nanny Libby, my mum's mum, wasn't a very good mum around that time. And yet, when I came along, despite my nan's opposition to me coming along, she melted instantly when I was born. I mean, she literally melted and she fainted during the childbirth. But that was the beginning of a real mother-daughter bond between my mum and my nan, and a very special bond. But the nun I grew up with, she was always rushing around to political meetings. She was a rabble-rouser, a trouble causer. She was a member of the Labour Party, a left-wing member of the Labour Party. She was, I mean, she'd be horrified that I'm sat here in the News UK building because she was picketing. She was picketing and protesting News International's move to Wapping. She fought very hard for tenants. She ran the local tenants association. She was amazing, and an amazing nan, an amazing campaigner. And the tragedy is because she was deeply ashamed of her criminal record. She could have been a Labour councillor. She might have even been a member of the Parliamentary Labour Party. But that criminal record held her back. And she was asked to stand for the local council by the Labour Party. And she said absolutely not, because she feared the criminal record would come up and embarrass her, embarrass the family. And she was deeply ashamed of that criminal record.
How did the two families get on, having been brought together by the arrival of you? Because what is so clear from the book is just this enormous village of love that you were brought up in. But that doesn't mean that did the Bills get on? Did people get on?
The Bills didn't spend a great deal of time together. My granddad Streeting was almost like a surrogate father to my mum, and they had that close bond. The families did get on always, and the reason my mum and dad met was through my aunt, and there's that sort of network of friendship. And but the Streetings and the Crowleys are in some ways stereotypical East End families, but very different stereotypical East End families. I mean, Bill Streeting, my granddad on my dad's side, very representative of the Streeting family. It kind of started off as a very nuclear East End family, all lived on the same street. All had that same work ethic, going out, work hard, play by the rules, a family that's largely conservative voters. My mum's side of the family, I wouldn't say that Bill Crowley is representative of everyone else, because fortunately we don't have loads of criminal records on that side of the family, but a very different family in terms of politics, outlook, and there was a lot of ducking and diving and bobbing and weaving, and didn't have a lot of money and food to go around, so it was a case of, oh look, this has just fallen off the back of a van. Or my granddad would bring home his spoils of his criminal endeavours, so it was a very different kind of environment. My mum and dad's childhoods were very, very different.
I love the idea that for a month your family just ate solid seafood because decent number of crates of seafood had fallen off the back of the lorry.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. When Grandad Pops, my mum's dad, whenever he was doing a legitimate line of work, he still found the way to basically come into some nice goods. So there was, I think, one point where every doormat across that bit of the East End had this lovely buffalo kind of doormat that, because he happened to be working for the company and doing some shipping for them. So some of the mats came his way, and he was very generous with other people's belongings. The Robin
Hood of doormats, yeah. And tell me a little bit though about the poverty, because you know, it would be easy to kind of romanticize that, but for you as a small boy, it was so real and really unpleasant. At one point, you described going back to the flat where your mum had been living, and there was such an infestation of fleas. When you walked in, it actually looked like you had socks on.
Black socks.
So many.
Yeah, look, there's nothing romantic or glamorous about politics, and I remember Alan Johnson, who's one of my Labour heroes, once saying, you know, I didn't grow up in poverty to give the Labour Party a good backstory, and that's how I feel as well. I think that, you know, this is not a misery memoir, and I had a happy childhood, but there were moments of real hardship, and as I got older, I was becoming more and more acutely aware that we were different, even relative to the standards of the East End at the time. You know, I had a really good friend at primary and secondary school who seemed rich compared to our family. And I mean, his dad was a taxi driver and but did some professional photography on the side. His mum worked as an estate agent. So, you know, these are hardly the Rees-Moggs, but they, you know, they own their own apartment overlooking Shadwell Basin. I loved going to play there. They had, you know, my best friend had all of these sort of opportunities that come with having kind of a secure family income. And I thought, well, actually, we're a lot worse off. I didn't invite kids around to play in my flat because I was too ashamed of it. We had problems with cockroaches from next door. That episode with fleas, I mean, yeah, that was, I mean, it was funny, like kind of almost looking back, because, you know, my mum had been given a sofa. Unbeknownst to us, it had some fleas. They then spread. We went to stay with my nan for a while, but we had to go back to the flat to get something. And so I was just standing inside the door, and I just remember this sort of kind of tickling feeling, and I started to laugh, and I looked down and I literally saw like this swarm of fleas, and I just started screaming. And so there's this, I just remember like my mum kind of screaming, coming down, dragging me out, and we were sort of running down the street, and she was sort of stripping me off as we went and sort of flinging my t-shirt and shorts here and there. And we got back to my nan's where we were staying, and, you know, boiling water straight on the sort of, you know, remaining clothes and straight in the shower. And, you know, me and my mum laugh about it now, but it wasn't funny at the time. It was pretty scary. And, you know, similarly, other experiences I had, like, you know, the electric meter cutting out, but the money having gone, and having to traipse around our family to scrape together some money to put some more money in the meter key, and then having to walk up to, you know, half an hour walk to Cambridge Heath Road where the charging meter was in Bethnal Green. It was, there were moments like that which were miserable, utterly miserable.
So now when you're sitting in a room where people are talking about how to solve the issues of poverty, and you know that you're not with people who have had that experience of it, what do you say to them, and how do you need to convey to them what the reality is? Or do you not need to have lived it to be able to be empathetic and understand it?
You don't need to have lived it to be empathetic and to understand. But what I do see in so much in politics is the lack of lived experience in the room leads to really bad decisions. You know, I look at Rishi Sunak and the Conservative cabinet, and look, it's not that I think Rishi goes into work saying, how can I plunge more kids into poverty today? But because he doesn't understand the sorts of struggles that family goes through, he doesn't understand what £20 a week lost in universal credit would mean for those families. And when I hear some Conservative MPs saying, oh, it's just about making better choices, I just think, like, what planet are you living on? And we can always try and pick out the stereotypes of the layabouts, the scroungers, the spongers. And as with all stereotypes, there will always be people who take the mick, try and fiddle the system. Some examples of that in my book, actually. But that's not representative. And actually what I see a lot of in my own constituency today are people quite the opposite, slogging their guts out in 3 jobs or more and not making ends meet. And the tragic irony for me today as a constituency MP is there are kids growing up in the same poverty that I experienced growing up, but the council house that I was desperate to escape from is something they now aspire to. because they are in temporary bed and breakfast accommodation. They are being shoved from pillar to post. And what opportunities are there then for the sorts of interventions that made the difference in my life and meant I ended up in Parliament rather than prison? You know, I had a great state education with amazing teachers. Well, how do teachers build those relationships if the kids are moving from school to school? This amazing East End extended family that helped my mum with childcare or helped with shopping and a bit of food here and there. If kids are moved or uprooted from where they live, well, how do you build that security? And there was one case I will never forget, of a mum who had fled domestic violence, came to my surgery with 3 daughters in tow. She was being evicted because she couldn't afford to pay the rent. She was holding down, I think, 2 or 3 jobs. And she was moved from Ilford to the other side of London, away from the schools and the jobs, but she was commuting across every day, trying to make it all work. She had no cooker, no washing machine. She was hand washing. It was just the most unbelievable, cruel hardship that she was going through. And then she was moved up to the West Midlands, away from the networks, away from the schools, away from the jobs. And I think on so many levels, things are worse now than they were in the 1980s. And it breaks my heart. And I just think there aren't enough people in the cabinet who understand that. And I think in the shadow cabinet, there's people like me, Keir, Angela Rayner, Bridget Phillipson, John Ashworth. You know, we have lived some of that hardship and experience. And I think it does give us that, not just empathy, but insight into what you've got to do to solve these problems.
Just while we're on the topic of experience, were you to form the next government, how would you acknowledge that there are very few people in that shadow cabinet with real experience of government and taking the hard decisions? And have you undergone some kind of training in order to fill that gap?
We're not in a too dissimilar situation to where the Blair team were pre-1997. I mean, we're fortunate in that in Keir, we've got someone who came into politics late and has run a big public service. And that's why I think sometimes he lets the veil down a bit and shows actually, I think, a bit of disdain that he has for the way our political system operates and his lack of patience for, you know, the people who do sort of, you know, big political speeches, but when you kind of delve into it, they don't really have much by way of substance about how you change things. So I think he's got healthy cynicism about politics that will make him a great prime minister. We've got some brilliant people in the shadow cabinet like Pat McFadden, who have been there in government and driving things right from the heart of government. And for the rest of us, I think certainly in my own case, I am blessed with a very wide-ranging cast of former health secretaries and health ministers in the last Labour government, and people who've worked at senior levels of the Department of Health and the NHS over those years, who have been so generous with me in terms of their time, their expertise. In my team, I've got people like Liz Kendall, who's been a special advisor in the Department of Health, Gillian Merrin, who was a minister. So we're drawing on the talents of the last Labour government as well.
Is that your way of saying that you have had specific training?
Oh, we're taking preparation for government really seriously, and not in a complacent way of like, you know, measuring the curtains and, you know, what we'll have on the walls when we go in. That's not how we feel, actually, even with the polls as healthy as they are for Labour at the moment and unrecognisable from where Labour started when Keir became leader. We're really serious about not letting people down. And I don't just mean in terms of making sure Labour doesn't lose another general election, but I also mean the scale of the challenge this country faces, how difficult things are in the economy, in the National Health Service and across the board. We want to get this right. We're not going to be able to fix it all in the first term, but we know in order to earn a second term and a third term, you've got to keep your promises, which is why we are going through a slightly painful process, but a necessary process, and I hope for the voters a reassuring process of basically saying, look, we're not going to be able to do all these things in one go, in one term. And there are some things we'd like to do that we're not going to be able to do as fast as people would like. But I'd say to people who feel disappointed by some of the things that we've ruled out or said we're going to take our time on, you know, in that disappointment, you should feel some reassurance that we're serious about this. We're serious about making sure that we can deliver what we say, and serious about delivering the long-term lasting change our country needs, not just short-term sticking plasters.
Do you want to one day lead the country? Is this a very eloquent 311-page job application?
No, it's not. And I must admit,
Are you sure?
sort of I'm at a point now with sort of like, would you like to be the leader of the Labour Party questions, where
Would it matter?
it's so tedious now, because I think
But
that
would it matter if you did?
what if I want
If you said yes, one day I'd love to.
Well, I mean, I was asked. I won't name the newspaper because it wasn't part of this stable. But I'll tell you why. Like, I've now become a bit fed up with the question. Is when I answer honestly, and like part of this book is about saying to working class kids from backgrounds like mine, the sky's the limit. Reach for the stars. Don't let anyone hold you back. So I'm never going to be sort of apologetic or ashamed about having ambition. But what really annoys me is that, you know, when I answer these questions directly and honestly, as I always try to do with questions, it then, like, the other week there were a whole load of headlines, you know, Wes Streeting reveals ambition to be Prime Minister, which I got so much ribbing from my friends saying, oh, and this counts as news, does it? And the truth is, I mean, like, I'm not sort of joking when I say this. I sort of, you know, look at kind of politics, and I think, well, and the new generation of candidates we've got coming along, I tell you what, by the time we're at the end of what I hope will be at least 2 terms of a Keir Starmer government, there'll be loads of those whippersnappers coming up behind me saying, oh, well done, mate, you did a great job with the NHS, time to write your next memoir now, push off, it's our turn. And the truth is, I have a leadership role in the Labour Party, and if Labour wins the next general election, being the Secretary of State for Health with responsibility of taking the NHS from its worst crisis in its history to making it fit for the future is a huge challenge. And if the only thing I ever achieve in my life is doing that one thing, that one enormous thing, then I will consider my time in politics and public life very well spent. I will die a very happy man, and I will cheer on the next generation, as lots of my predecessors as Labour Health Secretaries are doing now for us.
We'll keep that little soundbite ready. There's some other really, really interesting stuff in the book, Wes. I was quite taken by your experiences of trying to balance your understanding of your sexuality with your faith. And it just sounded like a very painful place to be for a while, actually. And you say very openly in the book that you were afraid of God. You had that absolute fear that you were wrong for the faith that you were in.
Yeah.
What I thought was also remarkable was that a friend of yours who had been through the same experience carried with him a letter that had basically been written, was it by his priest to say you're okay?
Yeah, this was my first ever boyfriend, you know, and I shared how I felt and why I had been in the closet for so long, and he shared with me a letter that had been sent to him, which really moved me and reassured me. I still wasn't reconciled to that conflict. I still hadn't reconciled that inner conflict between faith and sexuality. And actually, it has taken me years since then to get to a place where I am now, where I think there is no contradiction. And it's been a long journey, because it sort of started off with me thinking, I tried desperately hard not to be gay. I'm pretty confident in saying that being gay is not a choice. Like people saying, you know, the old nature and nurture debate we used to have. All I can tell you is that I not only did I not choose to be gay, I chose for many years not to be gay, and it was painful and harmful when I see other people who've suffered in that way. And so I thought, well, this is obviously who I am. This is how I'm meant to be. And that was my kind of first stage of reconciliating my kind of who I am with God. And actually, the latest has been a brilliant book. I know I'm supposed to be plugging my book. Let me plug it someone else's for a minute. Michael Corran's The Rebel Christ. Now, Michael Corran had a global reputation as one of the leading conservative thinkers as an evangelical Christian. And it is a powerful, revealing book that takes the gospel and Jesus' example and kind of turns a lot of small c conservative religious teaching on its head and says, hang on a minute, Jesus was a radical. This is a guy who hung around with prostitutes and took on the moneylenders in the temple and was very much a revolutionary. And, you know, do I think Jesus would be on a gay pride march? Would he be marching at London Pride this weekend? I don't know if he'd be marching, but I tell you what, he would be absolutely taking on the people who shout fire and brimstone from the sidelines. Because the thing that saddens me about the way people feel about those of us in public life who are religious, not just Christian, but across the board, there are a lot of people out there who aren't religious who look at religious legislators and fear us. They fear that we're going to vote against a woman's right to choose, or fear that we're going to vote against LGBT equality. And I'm very proudly in favour of women's right to choose. I obviously vote in favour of LGBT equality. I'm one of the minority of MPs in Parliament who's voted to support assisted dying. I don't feel any contradiction between those positions and my faith. And in fact, I think the fundamental message of my faith, and actually representing a very religious constituency, a wide range of faiths, these are messages of love, inclusion, social action. If I think about the homelessness projects in my constituency, the food banks, a lot of those are driven by faith communities, not exclusively. And of course, there are lots of people out there who are atheists or agnostics, perhaps even kind of Richard Dawkins, militant atheists, who have very strong moral ethics and a moral compass. But it saddens me that people, when you talk about Christianity, they don't instantly go to loving your neighbour and that compassion. They go to, does that mean you're going to vote against my rights? And I find that so desperately sad.
But while the Church of England would still deny you the opportunity to marry in church, you can possibly understand that.
Yeah, I think that's why, to disagree with Alistair Campbell on comms advice, which is a bold move, I do God. And Alistair Campbell famously said to Blair, or about Blair, we know we don't do God. I think it is important to speak up and show moral, ethical leadership. I understand, actually, the Archbishop of Canterbury's really difficult role he has to play between holding together the Church of England and the Global Anglican Communion. And I don't envy him in that task. And I have a huge well of admiration for Justin Welby. But I'm also proud to see the Church of England speaking out on homelessness, on inequality and poverty in our society, because I think that is a central calling of our faith. And when politicians attack the Church of England for speaking out, my favourite is when politicians say, oh, typical Archbishop of Canterbury virtue signalling. If there is one person in this country whose job it is to literally signal virtue, it is the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I'm proud of the moral leadership the Church of England shows, even if I'm not entirely comfortable with the teaching on equal marriage.
I take your point about virtue signalling. It's a clever way to put it. Can I just ask you about Stonewall? Because you worked for Stonewall.
Old stomping ground,
yeah. So there has been some controversy about their advocacy within corporations of gender rights, of trans rights, and quite a few companies who had employed them to give them guidance has since withdrawn from that. And that includes the House of Lords, the NHS has been asked to by Steve Barclay, the BBC. If you were still at Stonewall, what would you make of that reversal by those companies? And do you think that Stonewall has got it a little bit wrong?
I think this neatly follows on from our last discussion, actually. When I worked at Stonewall, equal marriage was going through Parliament. And I actually worked in the education team leading our campaigning around tackling homophobic bullying in schools. So I wasn't directly involved in it, but I had a ringside seat, and I kind of watched as Ben Summerskill, one of the most effective lobbyists I've ever seen, did the hard graft of not just marshalling votes in the Commons on the Lords amongst the people who were already on side, all the quiet cups of teas, the conversations with people, some cases were directly opposed, and in other cases were unsure, sceptical, or anxious, particularly in terms of religious freedom. Would we be compelling churches and mosques and synagogues to perform equal marriages? Would we be suing priests who don't marry same-sex couples? All of those sorts of issues. And there was a fear of a conflict between the rights of same-sex couples to get married and the rights of religious communities who believe marriages between a man and a woman to practice their faith without state interference. And what Stonewall did was bring those people around the table and work effectively with the government, which also had to compromise because David Cameron had a majority of his own MPs against him, so he needed cross-party support. And compromise was found that maybe not everyone loved, but everyone could live with. And I've tried to take the same approach on trans rights and the challenges we have around for people who have issues with their gender identity, who just want to be accepted, included, and to be able to live their lives free from discrimination and prejudice. And lots of feminist groups, not all, but lots of feminist groups who say, hang on a minute, there's a conflict here in terms of sex-based rights of women, women-only spaces, and those moments and those spaces and those times where it might not be appropriate to have women's spaces that include trans women. And these are tricky, thorny, sensitive issues that need to be managed in a far more thoughtful and sensitive way than I think we've seen with the raging culture wars, some of the really ugly, clumsy language, and the cesspit of social media, where I just see kind of battle lines being drawn all the time, including among people I respect within my own party on the left of politics, but also this applies in the Conservative Party and across the spectrum. And so what I would like to see is a sort of resurrection of that approach we saw in equal marriage, which is bringing people together, creating the space where people can air their concerns without fear or prejudice, and where we find a compromise and a way forward. And I feel I'm an eternal optimist, but I genuinely think we can do that, but we've got to do it with care and sensitivity. Because the one thing I'm, as a gay man, and having had the challenges I had growing up, the one thing that I'm really sensitive to at the moment is that there are a lot of kids and young people out there in particular who are questioning their identity, who are afraid, and who are picking up the papers or turning on the telly and feeling afraid of politics and political rhetoric.
And other groups sometimes make that worse by encouraging such a hyper-individualism and self-identification in a world that might need to ask, exactly as you're saying, everybody to compromise a bit, and also a world that will need legislation at some point. So you can't just be having...
Yeah, so onto the sort of, where I think there's some... there's plenty of criticism to go around on this one. Look at what happened with the gender recognition legislation in Scotland. It is a really good example of why, as legislators, you can't only legislate with good intentions. You do have to legislate with some worst case scenarios in mind. And there were lots of women out there who felt silenced and gaslit when they raised concerns about prisoners, for example, who then we had this case of a man who, as far as I'm concerned, was blatantly abusing or seeking to abuse loopholes in the law, having perpetrated violence against women.
This is the case of Isla Gray.
Yeah, basically saying like, well, I may be a male sexual predator, but I'm defining as a woman now. And that's why we've got to make sure there are safeguards in law and protections. And, in terms of self-reflection and criticism, I don't mind admitting that if we'd talked about these issues a few years ago, I would have just gone, hang on a second, look, trans men are men, trans women, some people are trans, get over it. This is all kind of whipped up, let's just all just calm down and get on with our lives. And actually, it took me some time to be a bit less defensive, to listen to friends who were raising concerns, and have a bit of humility to say, hang on a minute, it's a bit more complicated than I've given them credit for. And I think, and that goes, that there's plenty of that to go around. I sort of see some of the language on social media, and like say, the term TERF, for example. Now, TERF is used as a kind of term of abuse towards feminists raising concerns, and actually lots of those feminists have said, okay, I'm going to wear that as a badge of honour. And what I see with that sort of language are people drawing battle lines and picking a side. And I don't want to build battle lines, I want to build bridges. And I think there's so much actual consensus in this space, but we've got to help people to get through the hostility, the hysteria, the heated rhetoric, and get to a point where we can unite around some basic concepts that trans people deserve to live their life with freedom and respect and dignity and safety and acceptance, and women deserve the right to live their lives feeling safe and protected with laws that protect them and aren't open to exploitation and abuse. And we can find a way through. I've no doubt about that. I would just pray that, especially in the run up to a general election, that we can drop these awful culture wars and have a more thoughtful, careful and considered discussion around these issues in a way that, you know, gets people around the table talking and compromising, and I think agreeing far more than disagreeing, if we're all honest.
Wes Streeting, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.